Michael and Sarah. For a time, those two names were synonymous with a storybook romance played out in the quiet suburbs. They met on a crisp autumn afternoon, in a small coffee shop tucked away at the end of a tree-lined street. Michael, then a young architect brimming with ambition, and Sarah, a literature teacher with a gentle smile and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 stories. Their love blossomed as effortlessly as wildflowers, resilient and determined. They married 2 years later, in a sun-drenched chapel filled with white roses and heartfelt blessings. To their friends and family, their married life was a portrait of perfection. Michael ascended quickly in his career, his name becoming respected in architectural circles. Sarah remained dedicated to her lesson plans and her students, a constant source of inspiration. Their house in the suburbs, with its small, meticulously kept garden that Sarah tended to with loving care, was always filled with warmth, if not always overt laughter, then a comfortable, lived-in silence. They often prepared quiet dinners together, watched old movies, and planned for far-off getaways. Their 5th wedding anniversary had passed only a few months prior, marked by an intimate dinner for two, bathed in candlelight, accompanied by softly spoken promises for the future. Michael looked at Sarah, the woman who was his world, and felt a profound sense of contentment, a feeling that life couldn't possibly offer anything more. He loved the way her brown hair fell softly around her shoulders, the slight furrow in her brow when she was engrossed in a book, even the faint freckles that dusted her cheeks after a summer day. To Michael, Sarah wasn't just his wife, she was his confidant, his companion, his entire universe. No one, least of all themselves, could have predicted that this shared smile, this quiet moment under the roof they'd built together, would be among their last truly untroubled ones. Happiness, sometimes, is as fragile as a wisp of smoke, capable of vanishing without warning. Their daily life continued, a rhythm of normalcy, calm and unruffled. Michael still left for work each morning, a perfunctory kiss for Sarah at the doorway. Sarah still went to her school, returning in the late afternoon to prepare their evening meal. On the surface, nothing had changed. But deep within, an unseen fracture was silently forming, a hairline crack invisible to the naked eye, biding its time, waiting for the moment to spread and shatter everything. One Tuesday morning, Michael woke feeling slightly off. A mild headache, a touch of fatigue, nothing more, he thought. Probably just the stress from work lately. He decided to schedule a routine physical, something he'd been meaning to do for a while. The initial results from the clinic were unremarkable, save for a few blood markers the doctor wanted to examine more closely. He was asked to return in a few days. Michael didn't dwell on it. He returned home, slipping back into the familiar cadence of his work and life. The day Michael walked out of the clinic with the final test results clutched in his hand, the sky outside was a brilliant, unblemished blue, the sun casting a warm golden light. But inside him, his world had imploded. The thin piece of paper, covered in cold, clinical script, felt like a sledgehammer blow to his very core. The diagnosis, HIV positive. Michael stood frozen in the middle of their living room, the test results slipping from his trembling fingers to the carpet. A roaring filled his ears, and the sounds of the quiet street outside faded into an unnerving silence. He couldn't believe what he was reading, he couldn't process this brutal truth. How could this be? He'd always lived a careful life, faithful to Sarah. That thought, sharp and sudden, sent an icy chill down his spine. Sarah. It had to be Sarah. His gaze drifted around the room, landing on the framed photos, the mementos of their shared life, each one now seeming to mock him. Their wedding portrait on the wall, Sarah's beaming smile, it all felt alien, tinged with a dawning horror. A sickening wave of disbelief, then a cold, coiling anger, began to rise in his chest, a gathering storm poised to obliterate everything in its path. He sank onto the sofa, his mind a blank. What was he supposed to do? Confront her? But what would he even say? He stared at the floor, at the discarded piece of paper that lay there like a death sentence for his life, his love, his future. And then, a dark tendril of thought began to uncoil in the recesses of his mind, the first shadow of a terrible resolve. Michael didn't confront Sarah about the diagnosis immediately. He needed time. Time to absorb the shock, time to grapple with the implications, and perhaps, time for the white-hot rage simmering just beneath his calm exterior to coalesce into something more focused, more chilling. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred in their home. The air grew heavier, charged with unspoken words. Michael became more withdrawn, his silences longer, his gaze distant. He'd watch Sarah as she moved about the house, her familiar routines now cast in a sinister new light. Every touch, every shared meal, every casual conversation felt like a betrayal. Was she aware? Did she know what she had done to him? The questions gnawed at him, fueling a growing resentment that was rapidly eclipsing years of affection. He began to observe her more closely, searching for any sign, any flicker of guilt or deception in her eyes. He noticed things he hadn't before, or perhaps, things he had chosen to ignore. The way she sometimes avoided his gaze, the occasional unexplained absences she'd attribute to meeting friends or running errands, the hushed phone calls she'd take in another room. Were these innocent occurrences, or pieces of a larger, more devastating puzzle? The man who had once prided himself on his rationality, his ability to think things through logically, found himself consumed by suspicion. His work suffered. He became irritable and distracted, his colleagues noticing the change in his demeanor but attributing it to personal stress. He couldn't confide in anyone, the shame and the anger were a toxic secret he kept locked away. One evening, about a week after receiving his diagnosis, he decided he couldn't bear the silence any longer. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. The domestic scene, once a source of comfort, now felt like a carefully constructed lie. He walked in, his heart pounding, his hands clenched at his sides. "Sarah," he began, his voice hoarse, "we need to talk." She turned, a smile on her face, but it faltered when she saw the expression on his. "Michael? What's wrong? You look pale." He didn't waste any time. He laid the test results on the kitchen counter, the stark black and white of the medical report a glaring accusation in the warm light of the room. "I went for a checkup," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "This is what they found." Sarah's eyes scanned the paper. He watched as the color drained from her face, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes, when they met his, were wide with a mixture of shock and something else, fear. He couldn't be sure. "Michael. I don't understand," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't you?" he pressed, the cold anger in his voice making her flinch. "The doctors say this is something I couldn't have contracted on my own, not recently. I've only ever been with you, Sarah. For years." Tears welled in her eyes. She sank into a nearby chair, her body trembling. "Michael, please." The confession, when it came, was fragmented, choked with sobs. She admitted she had known about her own status for a little over a year. A brief, regretted indiscretion from before, long before Michael, she claimed, from a past she thought she had buried. She said she'd been too scared to tell him, terrified of losing him, of destroying the life they had built. She'd hoped, foolishly, that it would somehow never affect him. Her words tumbled out, a torrent of apologies, excuses, and pleas for forgiveness. Michael listened, his expression unreadable. The loving husband, the man who would have moved mountains for her, seemed to have vanished, replaced by a cold, distant stranger. When she finished, a heavy silence descended upon the room, broken only by her quiet sobs. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply stared at her, his eyes like chips of ice. The betrayal was a chasm that no amount of tears or apologies could bridge. He felt a profound sense of revulsion, not just for her, but for himself, for the life he now realized was a charade. That night, he slept in the guest room. Or rather, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the scene in the kitchen replaying endlessly in his mind. The following morning, Sarah tried to speak with him again, her eyes red-rimmed and pleading. He cut her off, his voice chillingly calm. "There's nothing left to say, Sarah." His behavior became increasingly erratic in the days that followed. He stopped going to work altogether, calling in sick. He spent hours locked in his study, emerging only for meals, which he ate in silence. Sarah's attempts at reconciliation were met with a stony indifference. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. One afternoon, Sarah's closest friend, Emily, called. Sarah hadn't been answering her texts, and Emily was worried. When Michael answered, his voice was clipped, almost rude. He said Sarah was indisposed and couldn't come to the phone. Emily, sensing something was terribly wrong, pressed him, but he abruptly hung up. A few days later, Michael called the police. His voice, when he reported Sarah missing, was strained, tinged with a carefully rehearsed panic. He told the responding officers that he'd woken up that morning to find her gone. Her car was still in the driveway, but her purse and phone were missing. He said they'd had a small argument the night before, nothing serious, but perhaps she'd needed some space. He'd waited, hoping she'd return, but as the hours passed, his worry had grown. He'd called her friends, her family, no one had seen her. The initial police officers who arrived at the house noted Michael's distraught demeanor. He seemed genuinely concerned, anxious for any news. The house itself was tidy, almost too tidy. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication of forced entry. Sarah's clothes were still in the closets, her toiletries in the bathroom. The only things seemingly missing were her handbag, her cell phone, and Sarah herself. A search began. Friends and neighbors were questioned. Most recalled Michael and Sarah as a quiet, devoted couple. Some, however, had noticed a change in recent weeks. One neighbor remembered hearing raised voices from the house a few nights before Sarah's disappearance, though they couldn't make out the words. Another recalled seeing Michael meticulously cleaning his car in the driveway at an odd hour, late one evening, scrubbing the interior with an intensity that seemed unusual. Then came the first significant piece of unsettling evidence. Sarah's cell phone was found. Not by the police search teams, but by a sanitation worker, discarded in a public trash can several miles from their home. The phone was intact, undamaged. It hadn't been stolen for its value, it had been deliberately thrown away. When the police examined the phone's last known activity, they found that the final call made was to Michael, a call that had lasted only a few seconds, just hours before he reported her missing. And stranger still, data recovery specialists found fragments of recently deleted text messages. Messages from Sarah to an unknown number, speaking of fear, of needing to get away. And messages from Sarah to Michael, pleading with him to talk, to understand. The police also retrieved CCTV footage from a gas station located on a route leading away from Michael and Sarah's neighborhood. The camera covered a section of the road that Michael would have had to take if he were heading towards the area where Sarah's phone was found. Time-stamped at 3:15 a.m. on the morning Sarah was reported missing, Michael's car was recorded driving past. He was alone in the vehicle. He returned, heading back towards his home, approximately 2 hours later. Also alone. When questioned about this, Michael claimed he couldn't sleep and had gone for a drive to clear his head, looking for Sarah. But he hadn't mentioned this drive to the police before. Why the secrecy? The narrative Michael was constructing was beginning to fray at the edges. The image of the grieving, worried husband was slowly being chipped away, revealing something far more calculating underneath. The investigation was no longer just a missing person case. A darker suspicion was beginning to take root. The discovery of Sarah's phone, coupled with Michael's suspicious late-night drive, shifted the focus of the investigation dramatically. Detectives began to scrutinize Michael's every word, every action, with a new intensity. His carefully constructed facade of the distraught husband was beginning to crumble under the weight of mounting inconsistencies. They revisited his initial statement, the small argument, his awakening to find her gone. It felt too neat, too rehearsed. They decided to execute a search warrant for the house and Michael's car with a more forensic lens. What they had initially perceived as a tidy home now struck them as unnervingly sterile. The master bathroom, in particular, drew their attention. It smelled faintly of bleach, a scent that Michael tried to explain away by saying he'd been doing some cleaning the day before Sarah disappeared. But to the experienced investigators, it was a red flag. Using luminol, a chemical that reacts with the iron in hemoglobin, they sprayed the bathroom. Under the eerie blue glow, damning evidence emerged. Traces of blood, invisible to the naked eye, were present around the bathtub and on a section of the tiled floor. Though meticulously cleaned, tiny remnants had been left behind. Simultaneously, the forensic team examining Michael's car found minute traces of the same cleaning agents used in the bathroom, along with a single strand of Sarah's hair trapped in the trunk lining. It wasn't conclusive on its own, but it added to the growing unease. Michael, when confronted with this, became agitated, insisting the blood in the bathroom could have been from an old cut, a nosebleed, anything but what the police were implying. His composure, once so chillingly steady, was visibly cracking. The turning point, however, came from an unexpected source. During the initial neighborhood canvass, an elderly woman living across the street, initially overlooked, came forward. She told detectives that on the night Sarah supposedly vanished, she had been awakened by a strange noise. She'd looked out her bedroom window, which had a clear view of Michael and Sarah's driveway and front door. She distinctly remembered seeing Michael carrying something large and heavy, wrapped in what looked like a dark blanket or tarp, from the house to the trunk of his car. It was very late, she recalled, sometime after 2 a.m. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming he was perhaps discarding old junk. But now, with the news of Sarah's disappearance, the memory took on a sinister significance. This corroborated the timeframe of Michael's mysterious drive. Armed with this new testimony and the forensic evidence from the bathroom, the investigators knew they were no longer looking for a missing person. They were dealing with a homicide, and Michael was their prime suspect. The question now was, where was Sarah's body? The investigators theorized that Michael's 2-hour drive wasn't a random trip to clear his head, but a calculated journey to dispose of her remains. They began meticulously mapping out potential routes and isolated locations within that 2-hour radius. As the police closed in, they also delved deeper into Sarah's life, seeking a motive beyond the immediate rage of the HIV revelation. They re-examined her phone records, not just the recovered fragments, but also her call logs and social media. It was here they found another layer to the tragedy. Sarah had been having an affair. Messages between her and a man named Daniel, a colleague from her school, revealed a relationship that had been going on for several months. The messages spoke of stolen moments, of guilt, and of Sarah's increasing desire to end the affair, but also her fear of the consequences. Had Michael discovered this as well? Was the HIV diagnosis simply the final straw that broke an already fractured trust, or was it the primary catalyst fueled by this secondary betrayal? Detectives brought Michael in for another round of questioning. This time, the tone was different. They laid out the evidence methodically: the blood in the bathroom, the witness seeing him carry a heavy object to his car, the late-night drive, the discovery of the affair. Michael's denials grew weaker, his explanations more convoluted. He alternated between feigned ignorance and flashes of anger. He claimed Sarah had attacked him in a fit of hysterics after he confronted her about her infidelity and her HIV status, and that any blood found was a result of that altercation. He insisted she then stormed out of the house, and he had no idea where she went. But the story was flimsy, full of holes. If she had stormed out, why was her car still there? Why were her essential belongings, apart from her purse and phone, which he likely planted, left behind? And how did that explain the witness seeing him carry a body-sized object? The pressure mounted. Days turned into weeks. The search for Sarah's body continued, a grim and painstaking process. Then, a breakthrough. Based on cell tower pings from Sarah's phone around the time Michael had discarded it, and cross-referencing that with isolated wooded areas along the route of his late-night drive, search teams focused on a dense patch of forest preserve about 40 miles from their home. After days of combing through the undergrowth, a cadaver dog finally alerted its handler to a recently disturbed patch of earth, shallowly concealed beneath leaves and branches. There, they found Sarah. Her body was wrapped in a dark-colored moving blanket, identical to one missing from their garage. The cause of death, the medical examiner would later confirm, was manual strangulation. There were also signs of a struggle, bruises on her wrists and arms. And then, the detail that tied everything back to the house, back to Michael's meticulous cleanup. Her body had clearly been submerged in water for a period post-mortem, likely in the bathtub where he had killed her, an attempt, perhaps, to wash away trace evidence before he removed her. The final, chilling piece of the puzzle was found during the autopsy. Sarah was in the early stages of pregnancy. DNA tests would later confirm that the unborn child was Michael's. This added another tragic layer: he hadn't just ended her life, but the life of their child as well. Confronted with the undeniable truth of Sarah's discovered body and the mounting forensic evidence, Michael's composure finally shattered. He didn't confess in a torrent of remorse, but rather in a cold, detached recitation of events, as if describing something that had happened to someone else. He recounted the argument, the revelation of the HIV, and then, in a moment he described as a red haze, grabbing her by the throat. He admitted to placing her body in the bathtub, attempting to clean the scene, and then, under the cover of darkness, driving her to the woods. The affair, he claimed, he only learned about through the police investigation, though detectives suspected he knew more, sooner. His primary rage, he maintained, stemmed from the HIV betrayal. The man who had once been a loving husband, a respected architect, was now exposed as a calculating killer, his veneer of normalcy stripped away to reveal a core of icy rage and brutal deception. The full, horrifying truth of Sarah's final hours was finally laid bare. The discovery of Sarah's body and Michael's subsequent confession sent a shockwave through their quiet community. The image of the perfect couple, the idyllic suburban life, was irrevocably shattered, replaced by a grim tabloid headline. Friends and neighbors who had known Michael and Sarah for years struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew, quiet, reserved, perhaps a little aloof but seemingly devoted, with the cold-blooded killer he had become. The school where Sarah had taught was plunged into mourning. Students and colleagues alike remembered her warmth, her passion for literature, and the gentle encouragement she offered so freely. Her empty chair in the staff room became a poignant symbol of a life cut tragically short. Michael was formally charged with first-degree murder. The ensuing legal process was closely followed by the local media, each detail of the crime laid bare for public consumption. The prosecution painted a picture of a man driven by a narcissistic rage, a man whose image of a perfect life had been tainted, first by the HIV diagnosis, then by the perceived ultimate betrayal from his wife. They argued that the killing was not a spontaneous act of passion, but a calculated decision, followed by a methodical cleanup and a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators. The evidence was overwhelming: the forensic findings in the bathroom and car, the neighbor's testimony, Michael's suspicious late-night drive, the carefully planted phone, and finally, his own chillingly detached confession. The revelation of Sarah's pregnancy during the trial added another layer of horror and pathos to the proceedings, underscoring the totality of Michael's betrayal not just of Sarah, but of their shared future. Michael's defense attorney attempted to argue for a lesser charge of manslaughter, citing provocation and diminished capacity due to the emotional distress of the HIV revelation. They portrayed Michael as a man pushed beyond his limits, a victim himself of Sarah's deceit. But the jury, after deliberating for less than a day, found Michael guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, in sentencing him, spoke of the profound breach of trust, the calculated cruelty of his actions, and the irreparable harm he had caused. Michael was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Throughout the trial and sentencing, he remained largely stoic, his face an impassive mask, offering no public apology, no visible sign of remorse. He listened to the victim impact statements from Sarah's grieving parents and her sister, their voices thick with pain and disbelief, with the same detached air he had displayed since his arrest. Sarah's father, a man broken by grief, simply said, "He didn't just take our daughter, he took our ability to trust, to see good in the world. There is no punishment severe enough. The house where Michael and Sarah had shared their lives, once a symbol of their love, became a grim monument to the tragedy. It sat empty for a long time, the carefully tended garden slowly becoming overgrown, a silent testament to the darkness that had unfolded within its walls. Eventually, it was sold, the new owners unaware or perhaps choosing to ignore its history, but for those who knew, it would forever be marked. The ripples of the crime extended far beyond the immediate family. Friends struggled with feelings of guilt, wondering if they had missed any signs, if they could have intervened. Emily, Sarah's closest friend, was haunted by her last, brief phone call with Michael, by the feeling that something was terribly wrong, a feeling she hadn't acted upon decisively enough. The case became a cautionary tale, whispered about in local coffee shops and online forums, a stark reminder of the hidden darkness that can lurk beneath even the most placid surfaces of everyday life. The story of Michael and Sarah serves as a brutal illustration of how secrets, betrayal, and unchecked rage can escalate into unimaginable violence. The HIV diagnosis was undoubtedly a devastating blow, a profound shock that would test the limits of any individual, any relationship. But it was Michael's response to that devastation, his descent into cold, calculating fury, his decision to extinguish a life rather than confront the pain, that defined the ultimate tragedy. There was no undoing his actions, no bringing Sarah back. The legal consequences were clear, but the emotional scars left on her loved ones, and on the fabric of the community, would endure for a lifetime. The question that lingered in the air, unspoken but palpable, was how a love that had once seemed so real, so steadfast, could curdle into such lethal hatred. Was it a sudden snap, or a slow erosion of humanity, hidden behind a carefully maintained facade, waiting for the right catalyst to reveal its monstrous potential? The comfortable silence of their once happy home had been replaced by an eternal, chilling quiet, punctuated only by the echoes of what might have been, and the stark reality of what was. In the aftermath of the trial and Michael's imprisonment, the raw shock began to settle into a more somber, lingering disquiet. The initial flurry of media attention faded, but the story of Michael and Sarah remained etched in the local consciousness, a dark footnote in the town's history. People moved on, as they always do, but for those directly touched by the tragedy, and even for those who had only followed it from a distance, something had irrevocably shifted. The case forced a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about the fragility of trust, the hidden depths of human nature, and the terrifying ease with which a seemingly ordinary life can implode. Consider Michael. He was, by all outward appearances, the epitome of a successful, stable man. A talented architect, a husband who, for years, seemed devoted. Neighbors described him as quiet, perhaps even a little introverted, but certainly not a monster. He was the kind of man you might pass on the street without a second glance, the kind of man whose life seemed to follow a predictable, reassuring pattern. And yet, beneath that veneer of normalcy, a capacity for extreme violence lay dormant, waiting for the precise combination of pressures, betrayal, fear, a shattered ego, to awaken it. From a pillar of the community, a loving husband, to a man who could meticulously plan the concealment of his wife's body in the cold silence of their shared home, the transformation is as chilling as it is profound. It begs the question, how much of that darkness was created by circumstance, and how much was always there, lurking beneath the surface? Then there is Sarah. A woman who made a devastating mistake, a mistake compounded by fear and deception. Her infidelity, her concealment of her HIV status, these were profound betrayals. Yet, they do not equate to a death sentence. She, too, was a person of complexities, a beloved teacher, a friend, a daughter, a sister. Her life, with all its imperfections and its potential, was brutally extinguished. The narrative often risks reducing victims to their mistakes, but Sarah was more than her secrets. She was a human being who found herself in an impossible situation, perhaps making choices out of fear, choices that ultimately contributed to a sequence of events with the most horrific of outcomes. The tragedy is not just in her death, but in the loss of empathy that allowed her husband to see her not as a flawed human being in need of compassion or at least confrontation, but as an object to be eliminated. This case, in its stark brutality, forces us to look at the relationships we cultivate, the trust we place in others, and the secrets that can fester beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect unions. It's a reminder that behind the curated images of happy families and loving couples, there can be hidden fault lines, unspoken grievances, and vulnerabilities that, under extreme pressure, can lead to catastrophic failure. We like to believe we know the people we share our lives with, the person sleeping beside us each night. But do we, truly? Or do we only know the parts of them they choose to show us, the carefully constructed persona that fits our expectations? The story of Michael and Sarah is not just a tale of one couple's tragic end. It's a reflection on the destructive power of shame and stigma, particularly surrounding a diagnosis like HIV. While medical advancements have transformed HIV into a manageable condition, the social and emotional impact can still be devastating, breeding fear, secrecy, and, in this extreme case, a rage that led to murder. It highlights a desperate need for open communication, for compassion, and for confronting uncomfortable truths, however painful they may be, before they curdle into something far more destructive. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this story is its very ordinariness, up to a point. A marriage, a betrayal, a confrontation. These are human dramas that play out in countless variations every day. What catapulted this particular drama into the realm of true crime was Michael's reaction, his choice to respond to pain with ultimate violence. It leaves us with a chilling thought: how thin is the veneer of civilization? How quickly can a person we think we know, a person who seems so normal, cross the line into the unthinkable? This wasn't a crime committed by a shadowy figure in a dark alley, it was a crime born out of the intimacy of a marriage, in the perceived sanctuary of a home. And so, we are left to ponder. Was Michael always capable of this, a hidden monster biding his time? Or was he an ordinary man pushed to an extraordinary breaking point? Does the answer even matter to Sarah, or to those who loved her? The truth likely lies somewhere in the complex interplay of personality, circumstance, and choice. But the final, haunting question that echoes long after the courtroom doors have closed and the news cycle has moved on is this: in the quiet moments, when the facade drops, do we ever truly know the person lying next to us? And what unseen pressures, what hidden resentments, might be simmering just beneath the calm surface of the lives unfolding all around us, even in our own homes?